What do you owe someone who saved your life? And what if you found them 2 decades later, digging through trash to survive? The cold hit differently in Seattle that December evening. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind that crawled under your skin and settled in your bones, the kind that made you wonder how anyone survived outside when the sun went down. The streets glistened with a thin layer of frost, and the breath of every passerby hung in the air like small clouds of proof that they were still alive, still warm, still safe. Ethan Cole pulled his coat tighter as he stepped out of the sleek black car. The wool was expensive, tailored perfectly to his frame, the kind of coat that whispered wealth without shouting it. At 32, Ethan had built something remarkable. His tech firm, barely 5 years old, was already making waves in the industry. Investors loved him. The press called him visionary. His calendar was filled months in advance with meetings, conferences, opportunities that most people only dreamed about. But tonight, he wasn't thinking about any of that. His driver had taken a different route to avoid traffic, cutting through an older part of the city that Ethan rarely saw. The buildings here were tired, worn down by decades of rain and neglect. Graffiti decorated walls that nobody bothered to clean anymore. A few streetlights flickered weakly, casting uneven shadows across cracked sidewalks. And there, near an old bus terminal that looked like it hadn't seen regular service in years, Ethan saw her. She was crouched beside a dumpster, her hands moving through a pile of discarded trash with the kind of desperate efficiency that comes from practice. She wore layers of clothing that didn't match, didn't fit, had probably been found rather than chosen. Her hair, gray and matted, hung around a face that was lined with years of hardship. Ethan had seen homeless people before. Seattle had thousands of them. Usually, he felt a pang of sympathy, maybe dropped some money into an outstretched cup, maybe didn't. It wasn't cruelty. It was just life in a big city. You couldn't save everyone. You couldn't stop for every person who needed help, or you'd never get anywhere. But something made him look at her face. Really look. And when he did, time stopped. The world around him, the cold, the city noise, the driver waiting in the car, all of it dissolved. All Ethan could see was that face. Older now, weathered and worn, but unmistakable. The shape of her eyes. The line of her jaw. Features that had been carved into his memory 20 years ago, on the worst and most terrifying day of his childhood. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. He was walking toward her, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Wait," he called out, his voice cracking. "Wait, please." The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were cautious, guarded in the way that people who live on the streets learn to be. She took a step back, ready to run if she needed to. Ethan stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure of himself. How do you approach someone after 20 years? How do you tell them that they're the reason you're still breathing? "I'm sorry," he said quickly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you. I need to ask you something." She didn't respond, just watched him with those careful eyes. "Were you ever in Riverton?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "About 20 years ago? There was a flood." Something flickered across her face. A memory, perhaps. Or maybe just confusion. Ethan's throat tightened. "There was a boy," he continued, the words coming faster now. "He was 12 years old. He got caught in the floodwater near the old bridge. The current was pulling him under, and everyone was screaming, but nobody would go in because it was too dangerous. The water was too fast, too violent. He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was shaking. But you went in. You didn't even know him, but you dove into that water and you pulled him out. You saved his life." The woman's expression changed. Her eyes widened slightly, and her hand went to her chest as if she could feel her own heart beating too fast. "That boy was me," Ethan said, and tears were streaming down his face now, hot against the freezing air. "I'm that boy. You saved me." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The city continued around them. Cars passing, people walking by without looking, the world indifferent to this moment that felt like everything. Then the woman's lips parted and she whispered a single word. "Ethan?" The sound of his name from her lips after all these years, broke something inside him. He dropped to his knees right there on the cold sidewalk, this successful executive in his expensive coat, and he sobbed like a child. "Mrs. Lewis," he choked out. "Margaret. Oh God, Margaret, what happened to you?" Margaret Lewis stood frozen, staring down at the man kneeling before her. Her hands were trembling. She looked confused, overwhelmed, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. "You were just a little boy," she said softly, her voice rough from disuse. You had a backpack with dinosaurs on it. You kept calling for your mama. You stayed with me until the ambulance came, Ethan said, looking up at her through his tears. You wrapped me in your jacket even though you were soaking wet. You told me I was brave. You told me I was going to be okay. You were brave, Margaret said, and now there were tears on her face too. You held on. You fought. Ethan stood up slowly, and without thinking, without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around this woman who had been a stranger then and was a stranger again now, but who was also the most important person in his life. The person who made his life possible. She was stiff at first and used to being touched with kindness. But then she relaxed into the embrace, and Ethan could feel her shoulders shaking as she cried. People walking by stared. Some looked away uncomfortably. Ethan didn't care. Come with me, he said when they finally pulled apart. Please, let me help you. Let me. He didn't know how to finish that sentence. Let me what? Repay you? There was no repaying something like this. You couldn't put a price on a life. You couldn't calculate the value of every breath, every moment, every experience he'd had because she'd been brave enough to jump into that water. I don't need charity, Margaret said, but her voice was weak, and they both knew it wasn't true. It's not charity, Ethan said firmly. It's a debt. I owe you everything, Margaret. Everything I am, everything I've built, every single day I've lived for the past 20 years. I owe all of it to you. And I can't. I can't walk away from you again. Margaret looked at him for a long time. In her eyes, he could see the battle happening inside her. Pride fighting with desperation. The desire to refuse warring with the bone-deep exhaustion of surviving alone. Finally, she nodded. Ethan led her to the car, and his driver's eyes widened, but he said nothing. The man had worked for Ethan long enough to know when not to ask questions. The ride through the city was quiet. Margaret sat in the leather seat, her hands folded in her lap, looking out the window at the lights passing by. Ethan watched her, still trying to process the impossible coincidence of this moment. What were the odds? In a city of hundreds of thousands of people, on one random evening, taking one different route. It felt like fate, like the universe correcting something that had been wrong for too long. When they arrived at his apartment, a modern high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Margaret hesitated again. I'm filthy, she said quietly. I'll ruin your home. You'll do no such thing, Ethan said gently. Come inside, please. He showed her to the guest room, turned on the shower, laid out fresh towels and clean clothes that would be too big but would be warm. While she washed away years of street life, Ethan stood in his kitchen and tried to steady his breathing. His mind kept going back to that day in Riverton. He'd been visiting his grandparents for the summer. The flood had come suddenly, the river swelling from days of rain upstream. He'd been walking home when the water rushed through the streets, knocking him off his feet, dragging him toward the bridge where the current was strongest. He remembered the terror, the water filling his nose and mouth, the world tumbling around him, sky and ground indistinguishable, the certainty that he was going to die. And then hands, strong hands grabbing him, pulling him up, a voice shouting, I've got you. Hold on to me. Margaret Lewis had been 38 years old then, a woman he'd seen around town but never spoken to. She'd worked at the local grocery store. She'd had a son about Ethan's age, maybe a little older. She'd risked her life for him without hesitation. When Margaret finally emerged from the guest room, she looked different. Cleaner, yes, but also smaller somehow. Vulnerable. Without the armor of dirt and layers, she was just a woman, a tired, thin, aging woman who'd been fighting a battle she couldn't win. Ethan had ordered food, far too much of it, and they sat at his dining table in silence at first, just eating. He watched her eat carefully, deliberately, like someone who'd learned not to waste a single bite. How long have you been? He started, then stopped, unsure how to ask. Living on the streets? Margaret finished for him. Her voice was steadier now, after the shower, after the food. 6 years. Give or take. 6 years. The number hit Ethan like a punch. What happened? He asked softly. Margaret set down her fork and was quiet for so long that Ethan thought she might not answer. But then she took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was hollow, like she was reciting a story that had happened to someone else. My son died, she said simply. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He remembered her son vaguely, a teenage boy who'd been friendly, always smiling. I'm so sorry, he whispered. There was a robbery, Margaret continued, staring at her plate. Someone broke into our home. My boy, Marcus, he tried to protect me. He fought back. And they. Her voice broke. Even after all these years, the wound was still fresh. They killed him. Right there in our living room. And I couldn't save him. The irony was devastating. She'd saved Ethan's life, but she couldn't save her own son. But that's not why I ended up on the streets, Margaret said, and now there was bitterness in her voice. The neighbors, they started rumors. Said I was involved. Said it was suspicious. The police investigated me for weeks. They eventually cleared me, but by then the damage was done. People looked at me differently. Someone spray-painted murderer on my door. I lost my job. Couldn't pay rent. Had nowhere to go. She looked up at Ethan, and her eyes were dry now. All the tears cried out long ago. People believe what they want to believe, she said. And they wanted to believe I was guilty. It was easier than accepting that a good boy died for no reason at all. Ethan felt rage building in his chest. Rage at the injustice of it, at the cruelty of people who'd destroyed an innocent woman's life with their gossip and suspicion. I'm going to fix this, he said firmly. I'm going to clear your name. I'm going to find the truth and make everyone see it. Margaret smiled sadly. That was 20 years ago, Ethan. Nobody cares anymore. I care, Ethan said, and he reached across the table to take her hand. You gave me my life, Margaret. Let me give you yours back. That night, Margaret slept in a real bed for the first time in 6 years. And Ethan sat in his office, staring at his computer screen, making lists and plans. This was just the beginning. He didn't know it yet, but the truth he was about to uncover would change everything. Not just for Margaret, but for people he hadn't met yet. Connections that had been severed would be restored. Secrets buried for decades would surface. And in the end, what started as a debt of gratitude would become something bigger than either of them could have imagined. A story of redemption. Of justice delayed but not denied. Of family lost and found. But that would come later. For now, in the quiet of a Seattle night, a homeless woman slept in warmth and safety, and a man who owed her everything began the work of paying a debt that could never truly be repaid. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan's apartment, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Margaret woke slowly, confused at first by the softness beneath her, the warmth surrounding her, the absence of noise and danger. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. But then she opened her eyes and saw the clean white ceiling, felt the smooth sheets, and remembered. She was safe. In the kitchen, Ethan had already been awake for hours. His dining table was covered with papers, his laptop open to multiple browser tabs. He'd spent the entire night researching, making phone calls to people he knew in law enforcement, reaching out to private investigators. If there was a way to find the truth about what happened to Margaret Lewis 20 years ago, he was going to find it. When Margaret emerged from the guest room, still wearing the oversized clothes he'd given her, Ethan looked up and smiled. There were dark circles under his eyes, but his expression was determined. Coffee, he offered, already pouring her a cup. You didn't sleep, Margaret observed, settling into a chair at the table. Couldn't, Ethan admitted. Too much to do. He slid a notepad across to her, filled with his handwriting, names, dates, addresses. I need you to tell me everything you remember about that night, he said gently. Every detail, no matter how small. The robbery, the police investigation, the neighbors who accused you. Everything. Margaret wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, drawing warmth from it. For years, she'd tried not to think about that night, tried to bury the memories so deep they couldn't hurt her anymore. But now, looking at this young man who was willing to fight for her, she knew she had to go back. It was March 15th, she began, her voice quiet but steady. Marcus had just turned 19. He was working 2 jobs, saving money for college. He wanted to be a teacher. Her eyes grew distant, seeing the past. I'd gotten home late from my shift at the grocery store. Marcus was already there, making dinner. He was always like that, taking care of me, even though I was supposed to be taking care of him. She paused, took a sip of coffee, continued. Around 9 o'clock, we heard glass breaking. Someone had smashed the back window. 2 men came in. They were wearing masks, but I could see their eyes. Young eyes. Scared eyes, actually. I think they were just kids who'd made a terrible choice. Ethan listened without interrupting, writing down every word. They had a gun, Margaret said, and her hand trembled slightly. They wanted money, valuables, anything. I told them to take it all, told them we wouldn't fight, wouldn't call the police. But Marcus, her voice broke, and she had to stop for a moment. Marcus saw one of them reach for me, saw him grab my arm rough-like, and he just reacted. He pushed the man away from me, They struggled. And then there was a gunshot. Tears were flowing freely now, but Margaret kept talking, as if saying it out loud might finally release some of the poison that had been festering inside her for 2 decades. He fell right there in front of me. My boy. My beautiful boy. And all I could do was hold him while he bled. The robbers ran. Someone must have heard the shot and called 911 because the police came and the ambulance, but it was too late. He died in my arms. Ethan's own eyes were wet. He reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. I'm so sorry, he whispered. Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes. The police caught the 2 men within a week. They confessed. Said it was an accident, that they panicked. They got 20 years each. But that didn't bring my boy back. And the neighbors? Ethan prompted gently. When did they start accusing you? Margaret's expression hardened. Almost immediately. There was this woman, Mrs. Chun, who lived next door. She'd never liked me. I don't know why, just one of those things. She started telling people that it was suspicious, that maybe I'd planned it for insurance money. There was no insurance money, but facts didn't matter. She shook her head bitterly. Then others joined in. People I'd known for years, people I'd helped. Suddenly they were looking at me like I was a monster. Someone started a rumor that I'd been in debt, that I needed money. Another person said they'd seen me arguing with Marcus the week before. Which was true, we'd argued about him working too much, but they made it sound sinister. The police investigated you? Ethan asked. For 3 months, Margaret confirmed. They went through everything, my finances, my phone records, interviewed everyone I knew. In the end, they found nothing because there was nothing to find. They officially cleared me. But by then, the damage was done. She looked at Ethan with hollow eyes. People don't remember when you're cleared. They only remember the accusation. I became that woman whose son died under suspicious circumstances. I lost my job. The landlord didn't renew my lease. I had no money, no family, nowhere to go. What about friends? Ethan asked. Anyone who believed you? Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said softly. There was one person. A young girl named Lena. She was an orphan, about 14 at the time. She lived in a group home nearby, but she used to come to our house after school. Marcus tutored her. I'd feed her dinner. She was like a daughter to me. A small, sad smile crossed Margaret's face. After Marcus died, after everything fell apart, Lena tried to help. She was just a kid, but she tried. She'd bring me food, sit with me. But eventually, the social workers moved her to a different facility in another city. I never saw her again. Ethan was writing furiously now, a plan forming in his mind. What was Lena's full name? Lena Brooks, Margaret said. But that was 20 years ago. She could be anywhere now. Could be. Could be someone we can find, Ethan finished firmly. Margaret, I'm going to locate everyone involved in this. The police officers who investigated, the neighbors who spread rumors, and Lena. We're going to piece together what really happened and make people see the truth. Over the next 3 weeks, Ethan became a man obsessed. He hired 2 private investigators. He tracked down court records, police reports, newspaper articles from the time. He found the detective who'd led the investigation, a man named Frank Morrison, now retired, and convinced him to meet. Morrison, gray-haired and weathered, sat across from Ethan in a quiet coffee shop and shook his head sadly when he heard Margaret's name. I remember that case, he said. It haunted me. That woman was innocent. I knew it in my gut from day one. But we had to follow procedure, had to investigate. And by the time we officially cleared her, the court of public opinion had already convicted her. Do you still have your notes? Ethan asked. Everything's in the official files, Morrison said. But yeah, I kept copies. Couldn't let it go. Something about it always bothered me. What? Ethan leaned forward. Morrison frowned, thinking. The neighbors who started the rumors, Mrs. Chin especially, she was too insistent. Too eager to point fingers. I always wondered if there was something else going on, some other motive. But I could never prove anything. He agreed to share his files with Ethan, everything he had. Meanwhile, one of the private investigators had located Lena Brooks. She was now 34 years old, living in Portland, working as a social worker herself. When the investigator mentioned Margaret Lewis's name, Lena had reportedly gone pale and immediately asked for contact information. 3 days later, there was a knock on Ethan's apartment door. When he opened it, he found a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a worn jacket. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. I'm Lena Brooks, she said, her voice trembling. I heard you found Margaret. Is she okay? Ethan stepped aside. She's here. Come in. What happened next was something Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. Margaret was in the living room, looking through some of the old documents Ethan had gathered. When she heard footsteps and looked up to see Lena standing there, she froze. For a heartbeat, neither woman moved. Then Lena whispered, "Mama Margaret." And they were in each other's arms, both sobbing, 20 years of separation collapsing in an instant. "My girl," Margaret kept saying. "My sweet girl." "I looked for you," Lena cried. "After they moved me, I tried to find you. But you'd disappeared, and I was just a kid, and I didn't know how." "I'm here now," Margaret soothed, stroking Lena's hair like she used to when Lena was 14. "We're here now." Ethan watched from the doorway, his throat tight. He brought them together, but this reunion was about more than him. This was about family, chosen family, the kind built on love rather than blood. Later, when the tears had subsided and they all sat together, Lena shared her own story. She'd been placed in foster care, eventually aged out of the system. She'd worked her way through college, driven by a desire to help kids like she'd been. She'd never forgotten Margaret or Marcus, had never stopped wondering what happened to the woman who'd shown her what kindness looked like. "I have something to tell you," Lena said to Margaret, her hands twisting nervously. "Something I should have told you 20 years ago, but I was scared." Margaret took her hand. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lena took a deep breath. "When Marcus died, when people started saying those horrible things about you, I knew something. I'd overheard Mrs. Chun talking to another neighbor, Mr. Patterson. They were planning it." Ethan sat up straight. "Planning what?" "The rumors," Lena said. "Mrs. Chun had tried to buy your house 6 months before, Margaret. She wanted to expand her property. You'd refused to sell. So when Marcus died, she saw an opportunity. She and Mr. Patterson deliberately spread lies to drive you out." Margaret's face went white. "They destroyed my life. For a piece of property?" "I was 14, Lena said, tears streaming again. "I didn't understand what it meant. I tried to tell a social worker, but she didn't believe me. Said I was just a traumatized kid making things up. By the time I realized how important it was, I'd been moved and you were gone." Ethan was already on his laptop. "Mrs. Chun. Is she still alive?" "She moved to Arizona about 10 years ago," Lena said. "I checked once years ago, when I thought about trying to prove what she'd done." "And Patterson?" "Died 5 years ago," Lena said quietly. Ethan worked through the night again, contacting lawyers, reviewing property records. He found the evidence, documentation showing that Mrs. Chun had indeed tried to purchase Margaret's property, that it had been denied, that shortly after Margaret left, Chun had bought the house for a fraction of its value from the bank when it went into foreclosure. But as he dug deeper, something else emerged. Something that made him call both women into his office at 3 in the morning. "I found something," he said, and his voice was shaking. "In Marcus's police file, there was a note about his personal effects. Among them was a letter he'd written, but never sent. The police had kept it as potential evidence." He pulled up a scanned image on his screen. "It's addressed to you, Lena." Lena's hand went to her mouth. Margaret moved closer, reading over her shoulder. The letter was in Marcus's handwriting, written the week before he died. "Dear Lena, there's something I need to tell you, and I don't know how, so I'm writing it down to practice. I've been trying to find the right words for months now. Remember when you first came to us, and I told you that you reminded me of someone? I didn't tell you who. The truth is, you reminded me of my little sister. I had a sister. You have the same eyes she had, the same smile. Her name was Elena. When I was 7 and she was 3, our house caught fire. My mother, your grandmother, Margaret, got me out, but when she went back for Elena, part of the ceiling collapsed. They couldn't reach her in time. My mother never forgave herself. We never talked about Elena after that. It was too painful. But here's the thing I found out last month, after doing some digging. Elena didn't die in that fire. A firefighter got her out. She was badly hurt, burned, and they took her to a hospital in the city. But in the chaos, there was a mix-up. Records got confused. By the time they sorted it out, Elena had been placed in the foster system. No one connected her back to us. Lena, I hired a private investigator. I had to be sure before I told Mom. The DNA test came back yesterday. You are Elena. You're my sister. Your mom's daughter. I don't know how to tell you this. I don't know if you'll even believe me. But I have proof, and I have a plan. I'm going to bring you home, Lena. I'm going to bring you back to your family. I'm going to tell Mom tomorrow. I wanted to practice what I'd say to you first. You're my sister. And I love you. And I'm going to fix this. Marcus. The silence in the room was absolute. Lena was staring at the screen, her face drained of all color. Margaret had both hands pressed to her mouth, her entire body shaking. No, Margaret whispered. No, that's not. Elena died. They told me she died. I saw the hospital records, But even as she spoke, she was looking at Lena, really looking, and Ethan could see the recognition dawning. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the smile, features that had been there all along, hidden by time and trauma and the impossibility of it. I had burns, Lena said faintly, pulling up her sleeve to show the scars on her arm. They told me I was in a fire when I was very young. They said my parents died. But they never told me any names. The records were incomplete. Margaret reached out with trembling hands and touched Lena's face, the way a mother touches a child she thought she'd lost forever. Elena, she breathed. My baby. My little girl. And then they were holding each other again, but this time it was different. This wasn't a reunion of friends. This was a mother finding her daughter. This was a sister's final gift from beyond the grave. The brother who'd found the truth but died before he could share it. Ethan stepped back, giving them space, his own face wet with tears. This was bigger than he'd imagined. This was a family torn apart by tragedy and cruelty, now being stitched back together by truth and love. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Ethan's lawyers confronted Mrs. Chun with the evidence of her conspiracy. Faced with potential legal action and public exposure, she agreed to a settlement. Enough money to ensure Margaret would never want for anything again, plus a public apology. It wouldn't undo the damage, but it was acknowledgement. It was justice, however delayed. The local news picked up the story. Woman wrongly accused reunites with daughter after 30 years. The community that had shunned Margaret was forced to confront what they'd done. Some apologized. Many didn't. But it didn't matter as much anymore, because Margaret had something more important than their approval. She had her daughter back. Ethan found Margaret's old property. Chun had sold it years ago, and it had passed through several owners. He bought it himself, though it took some negotiating. But he had resources, and he had determination. Then he did something that surprised even himself. Instead of giving the house back to Margaret, he proposed something different. I want to turn it into something that matters, he told both women. A community center. A place for people who've been forgotten, who've been judged, who've lost everything. We'll offer job training, counseling, temporary housing assistance. Everything you needed, Margaret, when you had nowhere to turn. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of hope. And we'll name it after Marcus, Ethan continued. The Marcus Lewis Center for Second Chances. Because he gave Lena a second chance by finding the truth. He gave you a second chance by bringing your daughter back, even if he couldn't see it happen himself. Lena nodded, unable to speak. They broke ground on the renovation 3 months later. Margaret, Lena, and Ethan stood together as photographers captured the moment. The woman who'd saved a drowning boy. The boy who'd grown into a man who repaid that debt. The daughter who'd been lost and found. On the day the center opened, they unveiled a plaque with Marcus's photograph and a quote he'd written in that letter. I'm going to fix this. Hundreds of people came. Some were curious. Some were guilty, hoping to make amends for how they'd treated Margaret years ago. But most were people who needed help, who'd heard about this place where judgment was left at the door, where second chances were real. Ethan hired Margaret as the director. She knew better than anyone what it meant to fall, to be forgotten. Lena transferred her social work practice to Seattle, working out of the center, helping families stay together. And Ethan? He split his time between his company and the center, because he'd learned that success measured in stock prices and profit margins meant nothing compared to the wealth of helping someone stand up after the world had knocked them down. On the first anniversary of the center's opening, the three of them stood in what had once been Margaret's living room. The room where Marcus had died protecting his mother. It had been transformed now, painted bright colors, filled with children laughing and adults learning new skills. He'd be proud, Lena said softly, looking at her brother's photo on the wall. He'd be amazed, Margaret corrected, her arm around her daughter's shoulders. At all of this. At finding you. At what Ethan built. Ethan shook his head. I didn't build this. Marcus did. He saved his sister. You saved me. I'm just completing the circle. No, Margaret said firmly, turning to face him. You're starting a new one. Every person who walks through these doors, every life that gets changed here, that's a new circle. And it all started because you remembered. Because you didn't look away. That night, after everyone had gone home, Ethan walked through the quiet center alone. He thought about that day in Riverton, the flood, the terror. The hands that had pulled him from the water. The years that had passed. The impossible coincidence of seeing a face in the shadows near an old bus terminal. He thought about Marcus, who died too young but whose love had reached across death to reunite a family. He thought about Margaret, who'd lost everything but somehow still had the strength to build something beautiful from the ruins. He thought about Lena, Elena, a little girl lost in fire and bureaucracy, who'd grown into a woman strong enough to forgive a world that had failed her. And he thought about all the people who would come through these doors in the years ahead, carrying their own tragedies, their own losses, their own impossible burdens. This was what a debt of gratitude looked like when you paid it forward. Not just helping one person, but creating ripples that spread outward, touching lives you'd never meet, solving problems you'd never see. 20 years ago, a woman jumped into raging water to save a drowning child. Today, that child had helped save her in return. And tomorrow, they'd save someone else. Together. The circle unbroken. The debt repaid in the only way that truly mattered, by passing it on. And in a frame on the wall, Marcus smiled down at them all, his final gift delivered at last. Family restored. Truth revealed. Love triumphant. Some debts take 20 years to repay, but they're worth every single day.